Welcome to this lecture on operations strategy. Operations strategy is concerned with using operations to create value. So we'll look at what is value. We'll look at some key themes in operations strategy. So the learning objectives are to understand the role of operations in value creation, explain competitive priorities and trade-offs, talk about the functional and the process views of the organization, then look at the link between operations strategy and corporate strategy, look at, when we implement operations strategy, how do we think about order winners, qualifiers for different markets, and then to understand what Pareto optimality is, because it has implications for strategic decision making. Okay, so what is operations management? Operations management is essentially process management, because most of the things we're going to talk about are going to be about managing processes. So if you look at the definition on the slide, operations management is the systematic design and control of processes that transform inputs into outputs, and this transformation could be for external users or internal users. Right? External users would be your customers. Internal users would be one part of the organization creates something that another part of the organization uses. So essentially, operations management is the design and control of processes, or in other words, process management. So what's a process? Process is a group of activities that has certain rules. For example, they may have a sequence. You have to do step 1 before you do step 2. You have to do step 2 before you do step 3. They may have dependence relationships. A certain step may depend on certain steps to be completed in the past. And they may have other conditions. For example, certain steps need to use raw materials and so on and so forth. Certain steps need certain information. And all of you, I believe, whether you've studied operations formally or not, are familiar with processes, are familiar with process management, because processes are all around us. If you go to McDonald's and order food, you follow a process. You may have to order at the drive-thru window, then you pay for the food, somebody prepares your food, you collect the food, and you leave. If you think about where most of us were born, you're probably born in a hospital, which is an organization with many processes. So a newborn has to have certain checks done on them before they can be released from the hospital. The release itself is a certain process. It may have implications about billing, about health, about follow-ups, things like that. And as we go through life interacting with different organizations, schools, universities, employers, we are always interacting with processes. So when you go to enroll in a school, you go through an enrollment process. You apply for a job, you go through a hiring process. Every year at your job, you go through an evaluation process. If somebody passes away, they end up in a funeral home. There's a process to have the funeral conducted. And so our whole lives are that we are experiencing life by interacting with different processes that are in different organizations. Now, if you look at this picture, we have certain inputs, and then we have a process, which is a series of steps with certain precedence relationships. Certain steps have to be done before others. Certain steps depend on others. And then this process leads to certain outputs. Okay? So that's fairly simple, easy to understand. What I want to point out here is that the yellow boxes. So when the outputs go to customers, they provide feedback. And that's an important part of process management. So why do we need feedback? The idea behind feedback is to control and monitor the process because things change over time. Okay, if you have a process that's working correctly today, it's not guaranteed it will be working correctly, efficiently, months down the line, a year down the line. And so you might wonder, why is that, right? Why would your process change? Well, maybe people don't know the process and they come and do their own thing, but you could document the process. So what if it's a documented process? Maybe you have a process chart on the wall. That shouldn't change, right? But that can also change. Most processes, they haven't thought of every single possible contingency or possibility that can happen. So something happens that the original process did not envisage, that it did not include. And so somebody had to go outside the process to handle it. For example, maybe you opened a box of supplies as part of your process to make something, and the supplies were damaged. And maybe in your process diagram, there's no contingency for what to do if something is damaged that you receive, because you expect the supplier to ship quality stuff. Or maybe a worker slips and falls and gets injured, and now you have to do your step of the process as well as the other worker's step, and you're not trained on the other worker's steps. You make mistakes that makes the process go off. Or maybe you change things because you're not trained in the other step, and the effect of your changes lasts for several days. Okay. A lot of process knowledge is embedded in people because even though you may have documentation, you may have rules, there could be knowledge built up over time that was not put in the documentation later on. So the process was documented at a certain time, and then later on, people found other contingencies, other issues that arise. They solved those problems. Maybe they improved the process in the way, and this updated process is not reflected in the documentation because nobody's always updating the documentation. And so the knowledge of this updated process is in people's heads. When some of these people leave, the knowledge leaves with them, right? And then the process changes and goes back to the original state where it had some issues. And now you have to fix the issues again. Okay. So for all these reasons, processes can change over time. If not for any of these reasons, you might want to improve them over time. And so feedback is an important element of process management where you can monitor and control the process, see when it's going off track, see when things are going wrong, and then you can take steps to resolve that. So the feedback loop is very important. Okay. This is a very high-level picture of a process. Another thing you might think about when you're thinking of processes and process management is what level of detail to think at. You can think of a whole company as a process. You can think of a unit within the company as a process. And each of these levels is made up of other processes. So when you go within the unit may itself have 5 or 6 processes, right? And so you could move up or down the level depending on what is the issue you are evaluating. If you're evaluating quality problems, you may have to go down to a production process level. If you're evaluating issues to do with morale, you might have to go to HR processes. If you're evaluating the performance of the entire company, how it's doing versus competitors, you may just look at the whole company as a process. And so the level of analysis depends on the question you are trying to answer. So traditionally, we have thought of companies as being composed of various functions. So there's a human resources functions. What do they do? Well, they hire people, they train people, people file grievances with them. Maybe they're involved in firing of employees, right? You have the finance function, which makes sure we have capital and money to run the company. There's an accounting function, which makes sure the money is properly accounted for, properly reported. There's a marketing and sales function whose job is to create awareness for the product and bring customers to the business, right? And then there's a manufacturing operations function whose job is to make sure things are produced. So that's the functional view of the firm. These different functions do different tasks, and each function may have a president or a director, and that's how the company runs. Okay? In operations management, we are usually not that interested in the functional view of the firm. Okay? Instead, we take what's called the process view of the firm. We'll look at different processes and we say, okay, our supply chain or business or operations is made up of these processes. Some of these processes, like the ones in green in this diagram, are called core processes. They're called core processes because they deliver value. They're the basis of value to external customers. Okay? And the other reason we want to identify and carefully manage core processes is that research has shown that you have to be really good at core processes for the overall company to do well. If you study successful companies, they are really good at managing these core processes. So we mentioned that a process is a core process if it's the basis of value for external customers, if it creates or affects value for external customers. So what is value? Value is reflected in what a customer is willing to pay for the goods and services, minus the cost of providing the goods and services. Remember, this is not to do with price. Something could sell for $10, but maybe customers are willing to pay $15 for it. And so if it costs $5 to produce, the value is not the price minus the cost or the profit. It's not 10 minus 5 or $5 of profit. It's 15 minus 5 or $10 of value, because a company may not try to capture all the value. Maybe they want to expand market share. Maybe they have a different strategy. Maybe they are trying to have a low price for now, because doing so allows them to grow faster. If they were to charge, the actual value what the customers are willing to pay, their growth might be slower and so forth. So there are various reasons. One of the major ones being you often only know generally what customers are willing to pay. You don't know it precisely. And then there are different groups of customers and segments of customers which may assign a different value to your product. But the key is that the organization is trying to create value. It's trying to maximize the amount customers are willing to pay, and it's trying to minimize the cost. So the difference between the customer willingness to pay and the cost is the value. And if you try to maximize this value, you have what we call competitive advantage. Okay. Let's say you're Apple. You sell a laptop for $1,000. Okay. However, it's so good that people are willing to pay $1,200 for it. Versus a laptop that sells for $1,000 and people are only willing to pay $1,000 for the second competitor's laptop. We would say Apple has a competitive advantage because people will see the Apple as a good deal. It's $1,200 worth to them, and it only costs $1,000. So the higher the value, the higher the competitive advantage, because people prefer Apple over the competitor, because even though the price is $1,000, the worth to customer of the other laptop is also $1,000, and the value is more for the Apple. But we sometimes say Apple has a better value proposition. Okay, so let's look at this process called supplier relationship process. Okay, the goal of this process is to make sure to get stuff from outside the organization, supplies we need, raw materials, components, and have them available at the right point so we can actually produce things. Look at the order fulfillment process. The goal of this process is that when a customer indicates they want something, they need something, it handles all the activities necessary to deliver the product to the customer and collect payment. Customer relationship process has to do with creating awareness at the customer, handling customer questions. If the customer wants to do a customer return or there's a quality problem, to handle that, make sure the customer is satisfied. And then we have the new service product development process, which deals with updating product features, launching new products. Okay. Now, if you look at these core processes, let's think about, and if you go back to the functional view, let's think about which function do these core processes live in. Okay. Let's think of the supplier relationship process. You might say, well, that lives in operations or manufacturing or supply chain, has to do with suppliers, right? Must be in supply chain, manufacturing, or so forth. Okay. Well, if we think like that and we say supplier relationship process only lives in operations, that's where this process is, and operations people are the only people who handle this process. What happens if there's an issue with supplier quality? So supplier ships you product or components which have some defects, okay? And sometimes defects are not caught during manufacturing. Often if a supplier is generally reliable, you may not test every single thing they ship because that's very expensive to test them. Some tests are destructive. If you want to test the strength of a material, you have to hang weights till it breaks. If it breaks, you can't use it. So some tests are destructive, right? You can't test everything. So some of these defective products get passed on, gets put into the final product and gets sold to customers. Okay, customer uses the product, there's a problem, right? A lot of defects are discovered while in use. The customer comes back and files a complaint or does a return. Okay, let's say it's a car, it's a Toyota. And so customer calls up the customer service, says, hey, my Toyota is having this problem. They say, no problem, bring it to the dealership. It's under warranty. We'll repair it to you for free. They repair the car for free. Is that the end? Should we stop here? If we do stop here, how does the supply relationship process and the people involved in it ever know that the customer had a problem? Well, how do we, first of all, do we know what caused the problem? It was a defective part. And then if we do figure that out, maybe the mechanic at the dealership figures out it's a defective part, how does the supplier relationship process figure that out so they can go back to the supplier and improve the supplier's quality so this doesn't happen again? But that can only happen if these red lines, these links between these processes are established. Okay? There needs to be a link between customer relationship process and supplier relationship process so that information about defects can flow back. And then the supplier relationship process can improve the quality of the stuff coming in. Okay. Let me give you a concrete example. When I was working, we had some furniture retail stores. And when the customer would come to a retail store, they would pick out a piece of furniture. The piece in the store would not be sold. That would just be a display piece. A packaged furniture piece from the warehouse would be shipped to the customer's home. A team would deliver it and they would install it in the customer's home. Right? Sometimes the bed, it needs some installation, or a sofa, it needs unpacking. Maybe the legs need to be installed for the sofa, things like that. There was this constant fight between procurement, supplier relationship process, who bought the material, and order fulfillment process, the people who actually fulfilled the customer orders, went to the home and delivered it. The procurement people, part of the supply relationship process, would say, the order fulfillment people would first say, we go to deliver furniture in people's homes. We open the box is fine. But when we open the box, the furniture inside is damaged or has scratches. Customer doesn't want it, says this is terrible piece. I want a nice pristine piece. So we have to take it back to the warehouse, get another piece, come back, open the customer's home. And this costs us money. It costs us time. Other customer deliveries get delayed. Other customers get mad with us. And the reason we have all these problems is because procurement people don't know how to do their job. They source these furniture from crappy suppliers, and the furniture is not very high quality, and then we discover these quality defects in the customer's home when we go there to install the furniture. The procurement people would say, no, we buy the best stuff. You guys don't know how to run the warehouse. how to store furniture carefully, how to pick carefully, how to load the truck carefully. You guys damage the furniture as you move it. You damage it when you install it. You guys are clueless about your job. You are the problem. It's continuous back and forth. You are the problem. No, you are the problem. No, you are the problem. No, you're the problem. Okay. So we did a project where we said, okay, let's record all the details whenever this thing happens. So whenever there's a problem in the customer's home, we record the order number, the item number, and we file this and we collect this data for a few months. And then we analyze this data. And what we found was that a few suppliers, their products were causing 80 to 85% of the defects found in the customer's home. And there were other suppliers who were causing almost no issues in the customer's home. So if it was the warehouse and the order fulfillment people who were to blame, why would they handle some suppliers' boxes carefully and other suppliers' boxes in a rough manner? They wouldn't. They would just treat any box like a box, right? And this would be suppliers for similar items, like supplier A for sofas, lots of problems in the customer's home. Supplier B for sofas, no problem in the customer's home. So you can't say, oh, the heavy items were being mishandled. So that means the problem is not in the handling. Handling is causing some issues, but most of the issues, because they're specific to a few suppliers and not, evenly distributed across all suppliers, is a problem with those suppliers. And we looked at those suppliers, and the buyer team was buying furniture which was reasonable quality for the price they were paying, but these suppliers were saving money on packaging. They were not packaging the furniture properly, and so it was getting damaged in transportation to the warehouse and then from the warehouse. And so this link between order fulfillment process, this red line, this link between the order fulfillment process, customer relationship process, and supplier relationship process, these links were what caused the data to flow, to be collected, to be analyzed, and for the root cause to be identified and the problem to be solved. Okay? Without taking this process view of the organization, if we just said this is procurement's job and they do this, and this is marketing's job, and just have a functional view, and we don't see how the information is supposed to flow between these processes, we would not have been able to resolve that. So the process view shows us the interrelationships between activities happening in the company. Who needs to talk to who? So, when you draw out a process view of the firm, even if you're sitting in a warehouse, okay, my actions affect this person and this activity, and their actions affect this activity. And so if this thing is happening, the root cause could be here, here, or here. And so you can make better process management decisions. Okay. So that's not to say the functional view is useless. Okay, both views are important, and I think the best explanation of why both views are important and what they're for is in the work of Lawrence and Lorsch. These are two professors at Harvard Business School. They did some research, and we're going to talk about the research and findings quickly, right? But let me first just briefly explain why the functional view arose and became popular, right? Why did we even have a functional view of the organization? Well, you see, it's really useful from an HR perspective, from the perspective of contracts, jobs, salaries, evaluating people, reporting lines, who reports to who, things like that, okay? So it's very useful for HR. Who has responsibility to do XYZ tasks? Who reports to whom? Who's going to be evaluated by whom, right? And so on. What it does enable is specialization. Each function can specialize. The people in the finance and accounting department don't need to be like the people who work in the warehouse, right? These people can be focused on money matters. They may know a lot about interest rates, banks, lending, whereas the warehouse people could specialize on other things like storage, like advanced equipment for moving stuff, things like that, right? So having these functions enables different evaluation and hiring processes to be implemented in each function, which leads to different types of employees in each function, which leads to specialization, whereas each function is really good at what it does. Okay, and that's important. Okay, the process view is useful to determine how things actually happen, the interconnections between activities. If you do a task, who do you pass it on to? Who else does it affect? Okay? And it highlights the collaboration because most functions are going to span functional boundaries. Like we talked about those core processes which span functional boundaries, and they have links with activities and other functions. Okay? What Lawrence and Lord showed was that especially in complex business environments, and especially if the organization was doing something complex, not something super simple like just making a simple, maybe just like a pizza shop or something, making something very simple. In complex operations and in complex environments, the organizations that did exceedingly well were organizations that had high levels of specializations and high level of integration. So they had functions which really specialized and did excellent work for their function, but they also had great integration where people understood how processes worked and they collaborated with other people who are on the same core processes, and the process communicated with each other. So if you have high specialization and high integration, you can have a highly effective organization. Okay? So both views are important. In operations, we focus a lot on the process view because we are focused on how activities actually take place, how to manage these processes, how to improve them, how to fix them, how to identify root cause, and so on. And so we really need to look at the whole process end to end. And for that, we're usually working in the process view. But we need to understand the other view is important and what each side brings to the table. And to be an effective organization, you have to be good at specialization and good at integration.